Okay, so last week we left off with, we were talking about insecticides. So tonight we're going to start off by talking about naturally occurring organic insecticides. Basically, these are a synthetic pyrethrin. Okay, so it's a synthetic chemical. They're usually manufactured. They're not always naturally found in the environment. Okay, basically what these do is these are a nerve poison, and honestly, we're not exactly sure how they work. Okay, basically it's like they paralyze the insect, and then we're not exactly sure what makes them die then. But we just know that they work. We're not exactly sure how. Basically, they do not need to be eaten. The insects do not have to be eaten, or they do not have to eat the insecticide. They are absorbed through the shell. So basically, if you spray it on them, or if they come into contact, if you spray it on the plant and then the animal comes into contact with it by touching the leaf, then it can be absorbed through their shell. Some examples of this would be like nicotine and caffeine. These are naturally occurring. These occur in plants often, and honestly, it's like the plant is coming up with a natural way to keep insects off of it. Basically, these types of insecticides have a low mammal toxicity, which means if we eat them, it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to harm us. They're not going to accumulate in our system. They are also biodegradable, and therefore, if we use them in the home, it's not a huge deal because it's not going to harm us and it's not going to harm the environment. It's just going to harm the things that we're targeting to try to harm. So it's kind of like a win-win situation. Another type of synthetic organic compound is something called a chlorinated organic compound. And basically what these do is these interfere with the sodium-potassium pump. For you, those of you who don't know what that is, there's a sodium-potassium pump in your cell membrane that regulates the amount of sodium and potassium in your cells because it's a very fine line between enough and too much. And so basically what happens is it affects this pump, and then the insects or whatever you're targeting, their pump is not going to work properly, and so basically they're going to die from having too much sodium and potassium or too little sodium and potassium. Basically, these are very persistent in the environment, which means they have a very long half-life. So if you remember back when we were talking about radioactivity, half-life is how long they're going to last in the environment before they go into a safer, more stable form, right? And so if they have a very long half-life, sometimes up to 4 years, this chemical or whatever you're using can be harmful in the environment to anything that comes into contact with it for sometimes up to 4 years. And so lots of things can change in the time period of 4 years. So we have to be a little bit careful when it comes to these. These have a low mammal toxicity, which means it doesn't affect mammals a lot. Okay, it's not going to build up in us. It's not going to be toxic to us. They're also very, very cheap. And one example of this was a DDT pesticide, which we're going to talk about DDT in just a second, a few more slides. But it was used widely in the 1940s, I believe, when we first started coming up with insecticides. Some other types of organic compounds. Basically, DDT has a low toxicity for mammals, but it's still toxic to some degree to mammals. So we're trying to find ones that are a little bit less harmful. And so basically this one is broken down in the liver. It's not stored in your fat, and so it's a little bit easier for mammals to get it out of their system. It's also less persistent, which means it doesn't last as long, and it's more biodegradable, which means it's not going to affect the environment quite so long. It's also more expensive than DDT. However, we used this for a long time. We used this up until 2002. However, in 2002, we banned it because it was found to be linked as a carcinogen, which means it can cause cancer. And so whenever we're using insecticides, whenever you're using chemicals, as in all chemistry, we often don't know the bad things. With good things are usually really quickly seen. The bad things, sometimes it takes decades before we start to see them. This chemical was actually used in termite control, and so up until 2002. So most of you probably were around this when you were younger. Some other organic compounds is lindane. This was actually banned in 2006 for agricultural use. However, we still use it a little bit in shampoo when you're treating for lice. Okay, it'll kill the lice on your scalp, but at the same time, the amount in the shampoo is so small, and it's such a targeted population that it's deemed okay. However, insecticides are not perfect. Sometimes insects can become resistant to insecticides. Some pass through life in a few days or weeks. Some have a very big evolutionary advantage, and that keeps us from we have to continue to develop new ones and new ones and new ones, because evolution is the process of the survival of the fittest. So the insects that are going to survive the insecticides are the ones that are resistant to it for one way, shape, or form. So just like to kind of compare it to something, you guys have heard of sickle cell anemia, right? Usually African Americans have it, right? It's a disease. It causes lots of inflammation and joint pain, right? But the reason it's so prevalent in African American is because in Africa, if you have sickle cell anemia, you are resistant to malaria. So the people who don't have it die from malaria. People who do have it don't contract malaria. So even though it's thought of as a bad thing, it's also survival of the fittest. They can survive. And so insects are the same way. Whatever makes them resistant to that insecticide, those are the ones that are living to reproduce. So their offspring are probably also going to be genetically prone to have that same resistance. And so this is why over 5 or 10 year cycle, we have to continue to develop or tweak or change insecticides, because the insects that survive are the ones that are there to reproduce. DDT, which again we're going to talk about in a second, we actually have DDT resistant mosquitoes, and this led to a decrease of its use in Africa and more cases of malaria. However, we didn't use it for a few years, and so it's now starting to become reintroduced back into Africa on a very limited scale, and it's starting to solve the problem because it wasn't used anymore, so then all the mosquitoes were able to reproduce. So now that we're using it again, that resistance has kind of weeded itself out as well. So it's kind of a give and take. Okay, another type is an organophosphate. These are very toxic to insects and mammals. Basically what they do is they block a neurotoxin. Basically they are not persistent in the environment. They break down rapidly, and this is a very good benefit. However, they are also not stored in the human body or concentrated in the food chain. And they are also not carcinogenic. So honestly, these sound pretty good, right? They don't store in our body. They're not carcinogenic. They sound pretty good. Another type of this is diazinon. This is widely used. I mean, you guys can see the packaging. Most of you have seen a package similar to this at Lowe's. It's not actually this one anymore because this was banned in 2003. But basically, we can widely use them indoor and outdoor because the side effects are very low compared to other ones. However, honestly, anything into a very high degree is not going to be good. Any chemical that you're taking into your body. And so this one was actually found to be very toxic to children because children have a habit of putting things in their mouth. And so if you're using this in your yard, all the toys that they play with in the yard are probably going to have it on their toys for some degree. And so it was also banned in 2003. Another thing that I want to talk about is something called a carbamate. Carbamate, it's hard to say. Basically what it does is it is also a neurotoxin. It is attacking their nerves. It has a low mammal toxicity, and it has no bioaccumulation. An example of what we use this is Sevin dust. Has everyone heard of that before? Another insecticide that you use outside to get rid of beetles and I think even ants, any of those annoying insects outside. In 1984, the worst industrial accident in the world occurred in India at a Union Carbide plant that produced and part of what makes this, there's lots of chemicals that go in to make an insecticide. One of the chemicals, basically what happened is water got into one of the tanks, and the reaction between the water and the chemical caused a pressure buildup. And so what happens when a tank and the pressure increases? Eventually it's going to blow. And so that's exactly what happened, is the tank blew up, and basically it released 40 tons of this chemical into the atmosphere. And what happens to a powder when it's released into the atmosphere? Spreads out because it doesn't weigh very much, right? Spreads out over a large distance, and then it starts to settle to the ground. And so basically just kind of blanketed the community. And 15,247 people were killed. I want to say it was 5,000 of them were killed almost immediately. The rest of them died over a few weeks or so in the hospital. Basically what happens is this is really hard on your lungs. And since it was a powder, it was really easy for them to breathe in. It's almost like, I imagine, kind of like suffocating to death because they couldn't get the oxygen that they needed. It also cost about $470 million in claims, which honestly is not very much money when you look at how many people were killed and injured. I want to say it was $500 per injured person and $2,000 per death, which is nothing compared to, I probably didn't even cover the medical bills, to be quite honest, you know. So $470 million looks like a lot of money, but it's not compared to how many people it injured. So let's go back and let's talk to DDT a little bit. Does anybody remember talking about this a few chapters ago? What was the issue with DDT? What did it do? Bald eagles.
Yeah, I was killing
Did it hurt the bald eagles? No. What did it prevent them from doing? Reproducing. And so DDT does not affect birds or whatever directly, and so that's why it was so hard for us to eventually find the link that it was actually DDT, because it's not actually hurting the bald eagles. What it is doing is it was affecting the enzyme they were creating when they were laying eggs. So they were laying eggs that had a very, very thin shell. And so when birds sit on their eggs, right, in their nests, and so basically they would sit and they would break their eggs and then the eggs would never hatch. It was synthesized in 1873, however, we didn't really know how to use it back then, and so it wasn't until 1939 that we discovered that it was a good insecticide, and then it was widely used around the world, and it had a peak production in 1961. And then in 1962, Rachel Carson, she wrote a book, and she described the problems with the bioaccumulation of DDT. In particular, she actually discussed how it was affecting the bald eagle. She was one of the first people that kind of brought it to everybody's attention, what it was doing. It's not that she discovered what it was doing. It's not that she figured it out. It's that she brought it to everybody's attention. And once she brought it to everybody's attention, the public demanded the end to the DDT. Once everybody started learning about the effects of it. It can be argued that DDT has saved more lives than any other drug because it kills insects that carry disease. For instance, in Sri Lanka, in 1946, there were 2.8 million cases of malaria and 12,587 deaths. However, that number dropped to 17 cases and no deaths in 1963 after the introduction of DDT. So we went from 12,000 people dying to 17 cases, no deaths, just by using insecticide. So it's just kind of a, yes, that's great, but at what cost are we going to have to pay for it? So maybe there's another way to fix this problem. And then once DDT was banned, it rose again to 2.5 million cases once the DDT was stopped. And so maybe there's a better way. Just to kind of, the bald eagles, in 1963, there was 417 nesting pairs of bald eagles within the lower 48 states. Once the DDT was banned, we have now risen that number back up to 10,000. So they are recovering pretty well. However, like I said, it's a teeter-totter. Yes, it saves lives with malaria, but at the same time, it's causing extinction in other species. And so maybe there's some better ways. And so we've actually tried to use natural forms. What makes some trees prone to some insects and not other trees? So we've actually started studying some of these effects. And sometimes there's insect pathogens. So like insects get sick just like we do. Just your dogs get sick, but what makes your dog sick doesn't necessarily make you sick, and what makes you sick doesn't necessarily make your dog sick. There are viruses and pathogens and fungi and protozoa that affect one species and not the other. And so we're trying to actually figure out ways to use these that are 100% natural, but at the same time we can target certain insects. Basically what these do is these can cause diseases in insects, and they are fast acting, which means as soon as we release it, it'll take maybe a week to 2 to get the results that we want, which is a lot faster than sometimes insecticides can take months, because it's honestly insecticides are affecting their ability to reproduce, not necessarily their ability to die. These are also species specific, so if we're specifically insecting one type of insect, then it shouldn't be harming anything else around it. So this is a lot more beneficial to the environment. One example is the NPV virus, which is used greatly against the gypsy moth worms. Basically, the moth themselves doesn't harm anything. It's the worms, the larvae form, that eat all of the leaves. And so basically this targets just the moth worms, and it prevents them from, basically it causes them to try to cocoon too soon, and if they don't eat enough before they cocoon, then they're going to die. And so basically it just causes them to try to go into the next stage of life before that they're ready for. There's also some different types of bacteria that we can use. We can use, one that I read about was, there is a insect that affects the corn and cotton industry. I think they're called bollworms. But basically, it attacks just the bollworm, and just like I was talking about with the larvae form, basically it makes them stay in their larvae form so that they don't ever advance into adulthood, because this time it's the adult version that are bad for the crop. And so it's just, sometimes it's the larvae form that's bad, sometimes it's the adult form that's bad, sometimes it's both, so we have to figure out which is harmful, which is good, and which one we need to prevent. Some newer methods of pest control. Honestly, this is not a new method. This is the method that we've always used and they've always used. It's just traps, insect traps. I mean, everybody's seen fly strips, right? This is how we used to do it. It's safe for the environment. It traps them with chemical attractants or pheromones. It doesn't release any chemicals into the environment. Basically, it just attracts them and kills them. This is also how we monitor insect populations. So actually, one of my friends, her husband, his job is to just inventory and kind of go through different areas of Southwest Missouri and see what insects are present. And so he has to set traps like this all over different places, especially when we're getting invading species, to try to determine if the fire ants are not supposed to be native to this part. And so he goes and he sets traps out where there's been sightings of them to make sure that they're not taking over, so on and so forth. A newer method of pest control that is actually pretty interesting is basically sterilization with radiation. Basically, when I was talking about the survival of the fittest, the insects that are surviving the insecticides, the insects that are surviving the traps, these are the ones that are going on to reproduce, so it makes sense that their offspring are also going to be resistant against those forms, correct? And so it's not necessarily, we don't want to kill the bugs necessarily, because that's not necessarily what we're wanting to focus on. Basically, what this does is it sterilizes insects, but they're still going to go and they're still going to try to reproduce. So basically, they're competing with the other males. And basically, a lot of insects only reproduce one time. So once they lay their eggs, they're done. And so if they mate with something that's sterile, they're going to lay their eggs and the eggs are never going to hatch. And so they're competing with the other males that are survival of the fittest. And so we kind of it's been a lot better at decreasing our insects than just killing them, because killing them isn't working necessarily. Some other newer methods of pest control are, again, chemosterilant. So basically, if we can find some way to mix chemicals with food or bait and attract, and then if they eat it, then it sterilizes them. So again, we're trying to compete with the survival of the fittest males out there. We're trying to get them to breed with somebody that's sterile so that they won't actually produce offspring. We're trying to do more research in this area. This is a new idea, but it seems like a pretty good one. Another method is natural repellents. Some plants are attacked by insects because they have natural repellents like nicotine or caffeine, for example. So, I mean, you guys have seen it. One plant in your yard gets attacked by Japanese beetles, but the one sitting right next to it is perfectly fine. It's because there's something on that bush that the Japanese beetles don't like. Okay, and so basically if we can figure out what that is and maybe find a way to genetically engineer crops or make a pesticide with that same chemical, because caffeine is not necessarily toxic. If you have it in too high of levels, yes, it's toxic. But we drink it, we eat it, it's not so bad. So if we can figure out why this one plant is not being attacked by the insect, if we can figure out how to make that work for all the other plants, then that's one way to do it. Sometimes it's just that the insects don't like the way it tastes, and so that wouldn't be damaging at all. Sometimes, like if the insects take in too much caffeine, it'll kill them, just like if you take in too much caffeine, it'll kill you. The thought is that if you could genetically alter existing plants to produce these toxins without damaging the plant or ruining its food production value, they will survive longer to be able to yield better harvests. And then another way that we can do pest control is to just bring in natural predators. So if you could introduce an insect's natural predator, that would help control the pest. But you have to be careful. So basically, one example is sugarcane was introduced in Australia from Latin America long ago, but with the sugarcane came the cane beetle. Well, in Australia, there was no natural predator for the cane beetle. And so basically what happened is it just started to grow exponentially. So then they introduced a cane toad to eat the cane beetles. So they introduced one predator to kill off the insects. But now there's no predator for the cane toad. So what's happening to that population? It's growing. Well, and what's bad about these toads is they have poison glands that if they are eaten by dogs or any other animals or any other small rodents or anything, it can affect the food chain in other ways because it's a poison, so it'll kill them. And so basically there's no predator that can eat these toads without dying themselves. And so we solved one problem, but then we created another one, maybe even bigger problem. And so then if we try to introduce a predator that can then eat the toads, well, maybe there's no predator for theirs. And so you just have to be careful when you're introducing a natural predator, especially in an environment where it's not meant to be. Some newer methods of insect control are insect hormones. Just like a lot of insects, they go through several different stages. Mammals, you are born and then you grow and you develop, right? Insects aren't quite the same. They go through 3, sometimes even more distinct stages. And a lot of times, in order for them to mature into the next stage, they have to be given a hormone, and that's why ants work in a colony. They have to continually take care of the larvae. So if we can find some way to either not allow them to get this hormone, then it will cause them to never advance into the adult stage. Or if we can maybe find some way to give them the hormone too early so they try to advance to the next stage before it's time, maybe it'll kill them ahead of time. So if we can find a way to maybe take care of it before they even become the pest, that's another option. This could introduce the hormone into the environment, so there might be some other side effects down the line if we do that. And so again, teeter-totter. We don't really know what's going to happen until we actually try it. However, usually these hormones are not toxic to higher animals, so it wouldn't affect your food chain most likely. And the reason that this is a good thing that we need to start studying is because insects are usually not going to become resistant to their own hormone. They need that hormone, so they're probably not going to become resistant to it. Okay, another type of pest control is a chitin inhibitor. Chitin is basically what their exoskeleton is made out of. So if we can stop the protection of this chemical, their exoskeleton is going to be very thin, and so it's not going to serve very much protection, so therefore they're going to die easier. Usually these inhibitors are very cheap and effective against beetles, flies, mosquitoes, gnats, some mites, weevils. However, it can also affect crayfish, crabs, shrimp, and lobsters, which are also have that same chemical in their exoskeleton. So what happens usually when we put these types of things on our insects, does it stay in this area? No. Usually it gets ran off into streams, and then it goes into rivers, and then the rivers dump out in the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so we talked about that last week, how the Gulf of Mexico is having a huge problem with all of this. Another newer method is we have the integrated pest management. Basically, this is a method by which the pest is scientifically studied. So before we even try to put an insecticide on it, before we even try to control it by any means, we're gonna take a step back, we're gonna study it, we're gonna see what its weaknesses are, we're gonna see what its strength is, we're gonna see where it's most vulnerable, and then all of these various ideas that we just talked about, we're gonna choose the one that is going to yield the best product, but at the same time with the less side effects. And so basically, instead of just throwing chemicals on the ground, we're gonna try to figure out the most strategic path with the less environmental issues. Okay, so now we spent a lot of time talking about insecticides. Well, herbicides serve just as big of a problem. We're talking about plants and weeds, right? The USDA estimates 10% of the United States crop production is lost to weeds, which is approximately equal to $12 billion a year. So just lost to weeds. Weeds are taking over, it causes the crop not to grow the way it's supposed to. And so this is also just as big of a problem as our insects. There are 1,500 species of weeds that, first of all, they can take nutrients from the soil. They can rob the plants of the sunlight and the space. Basically, the weeds are usually really fast growing. So if they can grow faster than the plant, then they can kind of shade the plant, which means they get the sunlight and the plant does not. They can also interfere with harvesting. So it's hard for us to get to the crop. It's hard for us to get to the crop without damaging it. And It also leads to a breeding ground for insects, which causes the other problem that we just talked about. So it's really, there's no winner here. In the year 2000, the U.S. used 540 million pounds of herbicides, which means that there was approximately 250 million acres treated. In the world, we use 1.9 billion pounds, and so a significant amount of it comes from our use. Today, there are 180 different herbicides and about 6,000 different formulations, and basically there's 3 different types. Basically, we have pre-plant, so we're using this before we even plant the crop. So we're treating the ground before planting. Pre-emergence means we're treating the plant after we plant it, but before it comes out of the ground. So we planted the seed, but it has yet to make its way through the soil. And then there's post-emergent, which means we're applying it to the foliage of weeds. So basically, once they're already growing, we can spray it on there to kill it. Most of these have a low toxicity to humans and are safer than insecticides. However, just like insects can become resistant, weeds can become resistant as well. And so some herbicides interfere with the photosynthesis, and others are synthetic hormones, which cause excessive growth. And so it depends on the weed, depends on what you're trying to do with it, depends on how out of control it is. So some chemical types of herbicides. First of all, we can do inorganic compounds such as sodium chloride, which is salt. We could do copper sulfate, sodium arsenate. These have all been used since ancient times and tend to be non-selective, which means non-selective means it will affect all plants, not just one specific type. The organic arsenals mimic phosphates and disrupt the plant's metabolism. Basically, remember if you talked about it, plants needed nitrates, they needed phosphates, right? They needed oxygen, they needed carbon dioxide, they needed water, they needed sunlight, and they needed all of these things, right? And so basically these types of chemicals are going to mimic the phosphates, thinking that they're absorbing phosphates, but in the process it will disrupt their ability to grow correctly. And so it's like tricking them into taking in a poison. Another herbicide was atrazine. This was synthesized in 1955, and this is commonly used on corn, sugarcane, pineapple, sorghum. And basically what it does is it kills broadleaf weeds. It's used in 80 countries, and about 60 million pounds per year is used in the United States. The good thing about this herbicide is it does not bioaccumulate and has low mammal toxicity, which means the concentration of it is not going to continue to increase over the use. And it's not going to build up in mammals. So mammals usually eat plants. And so as mammals eat the plants, it's not going to tend to accumulate in them. In 1984, we did, however, see that it did produce tumors in rats, and it was a possible carcinogen. So therefore, the EPA set drinking water limits to 3 parts per billion, but it's never really been officially proven to cause those things, but better safe than sorry. In 2000, the EPA Science Panel says that it is a likely human carcinogen, and they are afraid that it will affect the development in children. The plant that has been making them is being sued by its employees who claim that they have a 9 times higher chance of getting prostate cancer. And so basically there's been a lot of cases of prostate cancer in those employees, so there's got to be a link. Whenever you see a drastic rise in a specific type of disease or cancer based on a development of a chemical, we can usually find a link in there somewhere. In 2002, it was found that they caused defects in frogs, and therefore they had to limit the drinking water limit again. They lowered it a little bit more. It also appeared to cause testosterone change to estrogen. So basically, it was then causing hermaphrodites in frogs, which is basically frogs that are both female and male parts. Another herbicide is an amide. Basically, what this does is it inhibits the protein synthesis. This is used on corn and soybeans to kill grassy and broadleaf weeds. Basically, this affects their ability to stand up tall. So you know how grass, like it has to have some sort of structure as it's growing, or it would just fall on the ground, right? And so basically, this is the protein synthesis. So if you're affecting the protein synthesis of a plant, it's not going to have the strength to stand up, and it's just going to be laying on the ground, which is going to be a lot easier for it, or harder for it to get the sunlight and to not get trampled and to get the things that it needs. In 1984, the EPA considered this banned because it was shown to cause cancer in animals. And in 1987, the EPA limited its use to only certified applicators. So if we look back to last week when we were talking about insecticides, there was something called a certified applicator, which means we didn't ban it completely. It means that the only people who are allowed to use it are people who have gone through a class or training to know how to use it properly. And so this one hasn't been banned. It's just been limited to people who know how to use it. Another type of herbicide is basically used widely, and it inhibits or it imitates a natural growth regulator. So basically it is pretending to be like a growth hormone. Okay, it's not a growth hormone, but it looks like one, it acts like one, and so the plant will, again, take it up thinking that it's what it needs, and then once it gets there, it's almost like a poison, and it prevents the plant from doing what it needs to do. It prevents it from growing in the way that it wants it to grow. This affects dichotomous plants, which are like weeds, but it does not affect monocycline plants, which are like grasses. And so this is like your weed killer that you can spray on your lawn that doesn't kill your grass, but it kills all the weeds. Why does it do that? Because your weeds and the grass are two different types of plants, and the chemical has been targeted to one type of plant. Okay. They also think that there is a cancer link somewhere along the line, but we're not really sure what it is. So good thing is we don't usually eat the grass and the weeds in our yard. So hopefully that's why it's limited. Some other herbicides. We actually talked about this a few chapters ago, was Agent Orange. Remember us talking about that? Talking about dioxin. Basically what this is it is a 50-50 mixture of two different chemicals, and it was used in South Vietnam to defoliate the jungle. So basically they would spray it and it would kill all of the foliage, all of the plants and low-rising trees and everything so they could see the enemy. Well, basically what happened is they dumped this over 4 million acres, which is approximately 10% of the country. And what they noticed was that it was starting to cause birth defects in mice, and once we discovered this, we made it public in 1969 that we knew about this, and we knew that it was possibly going to cause birth defects. And then so since then, there's been studies, and I'm not really sure on this, but I'm pretty sure that there's been some birth defects and everything noted in Vietnam since this, directly caused by us dumping this on them. Basically, this was found, dioxin, which is one of the chemicals in the mixture, was found to be the culprit. And we talked about this a lot a few chapters ago. It was produced around here, and we had the same problem with it being dumped on the roads in Missouri. Basically, TCDD, which is the main culprit of the Agent Orange that we were just talking about, dioxin. This is probably the most toxic man-made chemical known, but we really didn't know about it because it was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was that was causing the damage. And so one of the ways that we found this was the timber industry uses about 1 million pounds per year to kill hardwoods and scrub timber in fir forests. Basically, what happened is there was a teacher in Oregon, and she noticed that 7 of her neighbors, along with her, had a total of 13 miscarriages between the 7 of them, which is pretty, I mean, that's a high number among 7, I'm assuming, healthy young women. That 13 miscarriages in the same neighborhood, that's not normal. And so, based on this, they were able to find a correlation with the dates of the forest spraying were found. So basically, the forest was sprayed at the right time in their pregnancy to cause them to have a miscarriage. Therefore, not just because of this, but because of lots of other cases just like this, the EPA issued a total ban on all of its uses. And the National Academy of Medicine reviewed 230 studies and also linked Agent Orange to 3 cancers, including Hodgkin's disease and maybe lung and prostate cancer. And so, in the miscarriage may have been a fluke, but if you take that in with all the other side effects that we had from similar chemicals all made with dioxin, it's able to easily see a link. We can also do genetic engineering. Basically, we can engineer plants which are resistant to their general herbicide, Roundup. However, now that Roundup is being used so commonly, we're beginning to get resistant weeds that are no longer killed by Roundup because survival of the fittest, the weeds that are survived are the ones that are there to reproduce. And the ones that are reproducing are also probably going to be resistant, so over time, the chemicals are no longer becoming effective, so we have to change our use. We can also have things to get rid of rodents. Rodents are most bothersome to man, especially in cities, because honestly, they carry disease. They're dirty. They can affect things very rapidly. They can damage things very easily. And so, but at the same time, they have very similar structures to us. So a chemical that works on them is probably also going to be harmful to humans. And so there's kind of a fine line. And so basically what we have discovered is in 1939 at the University of Wisconsin, a chemist studying sweet clover disease that developed in cattle who ate spoiled hay. He noticed that their blood would not clot properly. Okay, if your blood doesn't clot properly, every time you hit something or bump something and you get a little bit of bruise, you're basically going to bleed to death just by bumping into a table or a door frame. And so if we can give the rodents this chemical, they are most likely going to die without us having to catch them in a trap, without us having to physically find them. We can just set out bait for them, they can eat it, and then they will die from just going through the hole or the opening or wherever they're coming into your house from. This basically causes internal bleeding, but at the same time, it has an antidote. So if humans accidentally ingest it or your child accidentally ingests it or whatever, you can take them to the emergency room to get a dose of vitamin K, and it should do the opposite. It should fix the problem. And so yes, it kills them, but there's also kind of an antidote as long as you are monitoring it. Some other things are arsenic oxide, which basically corrodes the gastrointestinal lining and produces a hemorrhage and a shock. Another one is sodium fluoroacetate. This is very toxic to all mammals, including humans. We have sterokine sulfate that stimulates the rodents into convulsions. There's zinc phosphide, which is 80% effective. There is the red squill, which is an extract of wild Mediterranean plant. This is outlawed in Britain as inhumane because basically what it does is it induces vomiting in mammals. However, rats cannot vomit, and so basically it tortures them into death, which they ruled as inhumane. And you can also give them large doses of vitamin D because this can cause kidney damage. And so basically, rodents are hard to kill because they're mammals, so we have to find some other way to affect their lifespan. It always makes you feel bad when you think about what we actually do to kill these rodents, right? So, I mean, it sounds like we're torturing them a little bit. Be easier, I mean, I would like to just do one fell whack at them, but do what you have to do. Homework for chapter 17 is on page 331, number 1 through 17. We're not done yet. We're not done yet. I know.